Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your source material, the texts you want to understand better, and really dig into them. We pull the key insights, the important facts, basically trying to help you get informed quickly, but also thoroughly. And hopefully, we make it engaging along the way. Today, we're diving into a figure whose life story, as laid out in the material we have here, is pretty remarkable, really unique in modern American history, Donald J. Trump. We've got excerpts from a book titled Donald Trump, A Political Biography. In this text, well, it charts his whole journey, from being a real estate heir in Queens, then this huge TV star, right up to becoming a two-term U.S. president. So our mission today is to stick strictly to this biography, unpacking the story it tells, the successes, the failures, the controversies, how he used power, but only based on what's written here.
Yeah, the biography itself actually makes this point that understanding his specific path, which is definitely unconventional, is key to getting a handle on his impact on the U.S. An impact, the source says, some see as, visionary, while others view him more as a lightning rod.
Exactly. And think of us as guides just for this particular text. We're not bringing in outside opinions or other histories. We're focusing on what this author in this biography chose to highlight as the most important parts of his life and career. We'll pull out the main narrative threads, the moments the author flags as pivotal, the interpretations offered. The idea is to give you a clear picture based solely on this material, sort of cutting through the noise to get to the core story presented here.
That's the plan. And to do that, we're basically going to follow the biography's lead, taking it chronologically, starting right from the beginning. So yeah, settle in. Okay, let's unpack this life story as told by this biography. So the source kicks things off geographically and historically. It places his birth, June 14, 1946, Queens, New York City. It feels like a deliberate starting point, marking him as a New Yorker from the specific era and borough.
Right, and the text really digs into the environment he grew up in. It calls his family a middle-class developer family. Now, developer might make us think of massive skyscrapers today, but the source implies that back then in post-war Queens, it was different. It meant being involved in the practical side of building houses, expanding outwards, suburban growth, dealing with local politics, zoning, construction materials. Not the high finance world of Manhattan just yet. So the source suggests this gave him a very grounded brick-and-mortar understanding of business from the start.
The biography also zooms in on a specific part of his upbringing, his time at a military academy. It frames this as a period of, structured discipline.
Yes, the New York Military Academy. The text gives this some weight, portraying it as a really formative experience, quite different from his home life. The author suggests that this kind of environment, rigid hierarchy, punctuality being key, drills, a clear chain of command, probably instilled a sense of order, maybe discipline. The source doesn't give, specific stories, but the implication seems to be that this military structure, combined with the practical business stuff from his family, created a kind of unique foundation, sort of one foot in the real world of building and deals, the other in this more regimented system. And the biography seems to hint that you can trace some later traits in business and politics back to these early influences. This was where some core characteristics were forged.
Okay, so moving on from his youth, the biography then follows him into the business world proper. It mentions his education, first University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, which is noted as pretty significant before he officially joined the family firm.
Right. Attending Wharton, the text suggests, added that formal business education layer on top of the practical experience he got growing up. And the source clearly states he took over the Trump Organization in 1971. So this wasn't just joining the company. The source presents it as him taking the reins, starting to really steer the ship himself.
And the biography makes a point of highlighting a strategic pivot he made relatively early on. He shifted the company's main focus away from the outer boroughs and squarely onto Manhattan towers, which, the source emphasizes, was a really high-stakes, high-profile move at the time. 1970s, 80s Manhattan real estate.
Yeah.
That was the big leagues in New York City, right?
Absolutely. It meant dealing with complex city politics, securing huge amounts of financing, intense negotiations.
A very public, very competitive arena. And the source portrays this shift as his deliberate push into the spotlight, into the city's elite business circles.
And this move into Manhattan, into that high-profile environment, it happened around the same time as, and was arguably boosted by, the publication of The Art of the Deal in 1987. The source is really interesting here. It doesn't just list it as a bestseller. It analyzes it specifically as a crucial tool for brand building.
Yeah, this is what the biography really delves into, how his public image was crafted. The author spends time explaining that The Art of the Deal wasn't meant to be just a standard business book. It was, according to the source, a carefully constructed narrative, designed to create and project a very specific persona.
What kind of persona?
The source describes it as presenting him as this fearless, almost intuitive, incredibly successful deal maker. It argues the book shaped how the public saw him, far beyond just the buildings he built.
Right.
It basically cemented the Trump name as meaning a certain kind of brash, winning style in business, creating this powerful personal brand distinct from his father's earlier, maybe more low-key work.
Totally agree. And the source also notes that during this time, he branched out beyond just, residential or office towers. It mentions his moves into casinos, hotels, especially down in Atlantic City.
Right, venturing into entertainment and hospitality.
Exactly. Fields that rely heavily on public image and brand recognition. So this further diversified his portfolio, but also arguably raised the Trump profile even higher in popular culture.
But the biography doesn't shy away from the difficulties either.
Yeah.
It's pretty candid about the major financial challenges he ran into during these years. It talks about banking setbacks and, importantly, multiple corporate bankruptcies.
Yes, the text explicitly covers these rough patches. Significant debt, corporate bankruptcies tied mainly to the casino and hotel ventures. But what's fascinating, and the source really highlights this, is how it frames these struggles. It puts them alongside what it calls his resilience.
Resilience.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, the biography doesn't portray these bankruptcies as, the end of the story. It frames them more as trials by fire, challenges he faced and had to navigate within that super competitive, cutthroat New York real estate world, the city that never sleeps, as the source puts it.
Okay.
So the author uses language that suggests these experiences maybe toughened him up, gave him an ability to recover, to rebuild. It depicts him as someone who could take the hits, weather the financial storms, and still stay in the game, maybe bruised, but not out. So the narrative the source builds here is one of sort of surviving hardship in a really tough environment.
Okay, so let's fast forward quite a bit now, moving from that high-stakes 80s real estate scene.
Mm-hmm.
The biography brings us to a period that arguably completely reshaped his public identity again, his time on television. From 2004 to 2015, he was the host and also producer of the reality TV show The Apprentice.
And according to the source, The Apprentice was just transformative for his public profile, maybe even more so than his real estate work for the average person watching at home. The biography explains how the show very deliberately crafted and showcased a particular image, him as the ultimate decisive CEO.
Boss.
Exactly. The source points to those iconic boardroom scenes, the judgments, and of course that catchphrase.
You're fired.
Yeah.
Possible to forget. The source highlights that phrase specifically.
And the biography describes the resulting public persona as bold, direct, and polarizing.
Polarizing, right. The show presented him as this ultimate judge of who succeeds and who fails, making these quick, super confident decisions. And as the source points out, that image really clicked with some viewers. They saw it as strong leadership.
Yeah.
But it rubbed others the wrong way. They found it maybe harsh or just an act.
Yeah, it wasn't subtle. It was sharp, memorable.
Absolutely. And the source argues that those years on TV, it wasn't just entertainment. It built this incredible level of name recognition, public familiarity.
He became a household name, but not really as a builder anymore, more as this TV personality with a very distinct character.
Mm-hmm.
So the biography's narrative here suggests that this long period of media exposure, cultivating this bold, decisive image, effectively laid a unique kind of groundwork for a political career.
How so?
Well, he didn't need to build name ID the way traditional politicians do, through years of local office or whatever. He already had this massive pre-existing public persona, a persona very different from your typical politician, which, the source argues, arguably prepared him for a different kind of campaign, a more direct appeal to voters.
And it was really from that celebrity platform that he made the leap into politics proper. The biography marks his formal entry, announcing his run for president in June 2015.
And his campaign, as the source describes it, really leaned into that public persona built over years. The biography recounts his surprising win in the 2016 election, defeating Hillary Clinton. It's definitely framed as an outcome that flew in the face of most predictions at the time, underlining how effective his unconventional style turned out to be.
The source spends some time analyzing his campaign messaging. It characterizes it as very clearly populist. It explains that, generally, populist messages try to tap into the frustrations of ordinary people who feel kind of left behind or ignored by the establishment, the elites.
Right, and the biography picks out a specific phrase from his inaugural address, American carnage.
Yeah, that phrase got a lot of attention.
And the source analyzes it as really encapsulating that populist message. It spoke directly to a feeling, a perception among some people of decline, hardship being forgotten, and it promised radical change to fix it. It was stark, emotional language designed to hit hard.
And it definitely was stark. So once he's in office, the biography outlines the key policy areas during that first term. It mentions major actions on trade, on immigration, and on deregulation.
Yeah, according to the source's description, the general direction in these areas was pretty clear. On trade, it meant challenging existing deals like NAFTA, pushing to renegotiate them or just pull out. On immigration, it involved tougher border enforcement, limiting legal and illegal immigration through various means. And deregulation saw a systematic effort to roll back government rules across different sectors, environment, finance, and so on.
The source presents these as the core planks of his agenda, basically delivering on those campaign promises.
But the biography also gives significant attention to the major challenges and controversies he faced while president. Notably, it details the fact that he was impeached twice by the House of Representatives.
Right, 2 impeachments. The source lays out the grounds for each one.
It does. The first, starting late 2019, stemmed from the Ukraine scandal allegations about leveraging foreign aid for political gain. The second impeachment happened in January 2021, right after the events at the U.S. Capitol.
The biography states clearly that these events led directly to the formal impeachment proceedings.
Yes, it presents impeachment as the constitutional process for charging a federal official with, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. And connecting this back to the bigger story the source is telling, the impeachments are portrayed as moments of really intense constitutional conflict. They're shown as major challenges to his use of executive power.
So the author frames them as pivotal crises.
Seems so.
Yeah.
Crises that really highlighted these fundamental disagreements about where the lines are for presidential conduct and the balance between the White House and Congress. It implicitly raises this question. How did these impeachments shape his presidency overall, according to this biography? And the text seems to position them as defining conflicts, showing the fierce opposition and the constitutional pressures his administration was under.
Okay. And just to be clear, we're reporting how the source presents these events and their significance impartially.
Exactly. Focusing on the fact that they led to formal impeachment proceedings as described in the material.
All right, so moving beyond that first term, the biography then covers the 2020 presidential election. It notes the outcome, his loss to Joe Biden.
And the source describes the period right after the election as extremely contentious. It specifically emphasizes his refusal to concede the election results.
Which the biography flags as a major break from historical precedent.
Yes, a significant departure from the norms of peaceful transitions of power in the U.S. The source suggests this refusal set the stage for more conflict.
The text then goes on to mention the events of January 6th, 2021, specifically the insurrection at the Capitol. And it states that this event was the direct cause for initiating his second impeachment.
Yeah, the source draws a direct line from the Capitol insurrection to the start of that second impeachment process. It presents the impeachment as a consequence of the challenges to the election results and the events of January 6th itself.
And again, just stating the facts as they're laid out in the biography, reporting the causal link the source makes impartially.
Yeah.
The biography also includes a significant legal development from his post-presidency time. It notes he was sentenced for falsifying business records in New York.
Right. That legal case and sentencing are included in the source's timeline as a notable event after he left office. But then the biography pivots quite dramatically. It moves from these setbacks, the election loss, the controversy around the transition, the second impeachment, this legal conviction. It pivots to highlight what it calls a remarkable political comeback.
Remarkable comeback.
That's the phrase the source uses. It explicitly states that despite all of that background, he ran for president again and, quote, surprisingly won in November 2024.
Okay, so the author uses the word surprisingly. Why is it framed as surprising, according to the source?
Well, the source puts it in context.
Yeah.
It frames the win as notable, even surprising, precisely because it happened after that period filled with major political controversies and legal issues. Things that, the source implies, many observers thought would surely end his political career for good. So the biography portrays the successful return as this extraordinary political achievement. It suggests it showed his continued powerful bond with a large part of the electorate. It highlights, as the source sees it, his resilience against adversity and an ability to overcome scandals that would probably sink most other politicians. That's the narrative presented in this biography.
And that brings the story right up to the present day, or very close to it. The biography details the start of his second term, inauguration, January 20, 2025. And the source makes a point of the historical significance here. He's the 47th president, but also the first non-consecutive president since way back with Grover Cleveland.
Yeah, late 19th century. The source definitely emphasizes that historical rarity coming back after time out of office. And then the biography immediately zooms in on the start of the second term, describing just a whirlwind of activity. It lists immediate executive actions. It notes he pardoned some individuals involved in the January 6th Capitol events, and it mentions the signing of 26 executive orders very soon after taking office.
26 EOs right off the bat. The source presents that as a pretty high volume, doesn't it? Signaling a fast pace, big ambitions from day one.
Absolutely. The biography seems to interpret this rapid-fire use of executive orders, plus specific actions like the pardons, which the source just reports factually as occurring, as showing a clear intent. An intent to quickly enact his agenda, to make his mark immediately, and maybe address issues lingering from his perspective from the end of his last term.
The source then gets into specific agency and policy shifts made early in this second term. It mentions dismantling agencies that were created under the Biden administration, and notably, the formal U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change.
Okay, so thinking about the implications as suggested by the source, dismantling federal agencies points towards a goal of reducing the federal government's size or scope, or at least changing its focus significantly, moving away from the priorities of the previous administration, and pulling out of the Paris Agreement, which the source just states as a fact, well, that signals a major immediate reversal in U.S. international climate policy, a clear pivot away from those commitments.
So the biography depicts these as pretty decisive moves, taken right away, to fundamentally change the direction of government policy and international engagement.
That seems to be the framing, yes.
The biography keeps listing these early policy actions. It includes a renewed crackdown on immigration and implementing travel bans affecting 19 specific countries.
Right. These actions, as the source presents them, suggest a continuation, maybe even an intensification, of the immigration and travel restriction policies that were key parts of his first term. The source seems to frame these as immediate steps fulfilling campaign promises related to border control and entry into the U.S.
Then there's a policy initiative mentioned that sounds quite different. The creation of Trump accounts, designed to give a $1,000 seed investment to every newborn American child.
Yeah, the biography highlights this one as distinct, kind of novel, not your typical regulation or restriction. The source presents it as a direct financial investment in citizens right from birth, maybe suggesting a focus on long-term financial start or family support. It stands out among the other policies listed.
And the source also includes the removal of diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives within the federal government itself.
Yes. That action is described by the source as a clear policy choice to eliminate or ban DEI-related programs and directives inside federal agencies. So when you look at all these things together, the pardons, the EOs, dismantling agencies, Paris withdrawal, immigration actions, the Trump accounts, removing DEI, the biography really paints a picture of an administration hitting the ground running, moving fast and decisively across a whole range of issues, domestic and international.
And making changes that are in stark contrast to the policies of the administration that came before.
That's the overall impression the source conveys about those early months.
The biography continues to catalog more executive actions from this very active initial period. It lists things like new policies on drone defense, also bans related to certain vaccines and restrictions on access to IVF treatments, and significantly, deploying the National Guard in response to protests in Los Angeles. These are all presented factually by the source as actions taken.
Right. And these specific examples, as listed in the source, really underscore the broad scope of executive authority being wielded early on. It touches everything from national security, public health, social policy, to domestic order. The source presents them as significant uses of presidential power to push policy and react to events across many different parts of national life, all happening very quickly.
But the source is also very clear that these actions weren't happening in a vacuum. They faced immediate and significant pushback. It details considerable legal and political challenges emerging right away.
Yes, the biography definitely pays attention to the reaction. It specifically identifies where the pushback was coming from. It mentions challenges raised by state governors, legal actions filed in the courts, and opposition voiced by various civil rights organizations.
And the source describes the core of this pushback as questioning the administration's authority to take some of these actions.
Exactly. And this whole dynamic, as the biography presents it, really brings up important questions about checks and balances in the U.S. system, the limits on executive power. The source seems to frame this period as showing that inherent tension. The executive branch acts decisively, and then other parts of government or groups in civil society push back.
Testing the boundaries?
Right, testing the legal basis, the scope of that presidential power. The biography appears to portray this pushback almost as an expected consequence when you have such rapid, sweeping executive action. It's other institutions reasserting their roles.
And again, we're relaying how the source depicts this dynamic impartially, noting that the source says the pushback questioned authority. Okay, let's shift focus a bit from domestic policy and the reactions to it. The biography also touches on his approach to international relations, the global strategy. It talks about trade measures and specifically highlights tariffs aimed at China.
Yeah, trade policy, especially using tariffs as a key tool, is presented by the source as really central to his global approach in this second term. The biography broadens this out, though, looking at his overall style in trade negotiations. And interestingly, it mentions that his trade strategy is viewed as aligning with the goals laid out in something called Project 2025.
Project 2025. The source connects his trade moves to that.
It does. It draws a link between specific actions, like the China tariffs, and this wider policy framework. It suggests the trade moves aren't just isolated decisions, but part of a larger, more comprehensive strategic plan for America's economy and place in the world, as outlined in that project. That's a connection the source makes.
The source also notes some specific international activities during this time. A trip to the Middle East is mentioned, and efforts to negotiate new trade deals.
Right. Presented as concrete examples of where his priorities lie on the world stage. And the biography discusses the bigger picture, the overall implication of all these actions. It says they represent global stance shifts.
Global stance shifts. What does the source suggest that means exactly?
Based purely on the text, it seems to imply a move away from established multilateral alliances or agreements towards more bilateral one-on-one deals, maybe a stronger focus on transactional outcomes in foreign policy, what does the U.S. get directly, and potentially a reevaluation or reorientation of alliances based on the administration's definition of national interest.
So the biography frames these actions as fundamentally changing how America engages with the rest of the world compared to previous approaches.
That appears to be the interpretation offered in the source, yes.
And finally, the biography brings in public perception. It includes some data and analysis on how his presidency is being viewed. It presents a specific number, roughly 40% approval rating during this period.
And that 40% figure, as analyzed by the source, is presented as really telling. The biography immediately links this data point to its observation of a deep partisan divide in the country. Meaning that a persistent approval rating around 40%, according to the source's interpretation, shows two things simultaneously. An incredibly loyal core base of support among a large chunk of the population, but also equally intense opposition from another large segment.
So public opinion isn't really fluid or moderate, it's just sharply split.
That's how the biography describes it. Sharply bifurcated along party or ideological lines. Strong support concentrated in one camp, strong opposition in the other.
And the source specifies where that support is strong among his base.
Yes, it highlights the loyalty of his base. But then, conversely, the biography also presents the perspective of his opponents. It characterizes their view as being highly critical of what they see as authoritarian moves.
Okay, so the source lays out both sides of that divide impartially.
It seems to. It presents the unwavering support from the base, and then it presents the strong criticism from opponents focusing on these concerns about executive power, highlighting that polarization is the key takeaway from the public opinion data, as described by the author.
All right, so looking back over the whole arc that this biographical source has laid out, we've traced his path from, that developer's son in Queens, building this huge real estate profile, then the TV fame, and ultimately serving 2 non-consecutive terms as president.
And a really central theme that runs through the biography, as we've discussed, is this idea that throughout this very unique career, Donald Trump has consistently, quote, rewrote the rules, whether it was in business or later in the presidency itself.
Right.
And what's fascinating, and what the source really seems to emphasize, is how that non-traditional background coming from outside politics deeply shaped how he approached the job of president. The source suggests he just didn't follow the standard political playbook or adhere to the usual norms, and this disruption of the status quo is presented as a defining feature of his impact.
So what factors does the source point to explain his influence, his success, even with all the controversy?
Well, the biography synthesizes a few key elements it sees as crucial. First, his skill in leveraging his personal brand that name recognition built over decades. Second, his mastery of media, using television and later social media to speak directly to people, often bypassing traditional news outlets. And third, what the source calls his sheer force of will, this determination to dominate the conversation, command attention globally, and push his agenda relentlessly.
So the biography argues it's this unique combination of brand, media savvy, and personal drive that's central to understanding his power and position.
That seems to be the core argument presented, yes.
And a biography wraps up by leaving us, and you, the listener, with something to really chew on. A final provocative thought. It suggests his presidency forces us to ask some pretty fundamental questions about democracy today.
Exactly. The source concludes by explicitly posing these two big questions, which it argues are raised by his impact and his unusual path. Who defines democracy? And can disruption heal or harm? Big questions indeed.
Yeah, and the biography doesn't try to answer them for you. But by ending there, the source implies that his time in office, his methods, his whole approach, they really challenge our standard ideas about how democracy works, about what makes for effective leadership, and whether the kind of major disruption he represents ultimately strengthens or weakens the political system in the country. It leaves you pondering the long-term meaning of his unconventional journey. And that brings us to the end of this particular deep dive, our exploration of Donald Trump's life and career, looking solely through the lens of the biographical source material we examined today.
Yeah, we hope that by walking through the narrative, this specific source presents focusing only on what it chose to highlight and how it framed events. We've given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of the story as told in this text. Figuring out complex figures means really looking closely at how their stories are told, and that's what we aimed for here.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. As always, we encourage you to keep reading, keep asking questions, keep exploring the people and events shaping our world from multiple perspectives. Curiosity really is the engine of understanding. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep exploring.